Today we're looking at the first 4 books of Ovid's Metamorphoses. We're going to look at the first 4 books after the creation story, which we've already looked at, and examine the world that Ovid paints. And he begins the story with the gods and then slowly brings in humans. So we're going to look at how that works, how the divine world operates, and then how gods and humans interact in this story. We're also going to think a little bit about transformation, which of course is the topic of Ovid's book, but in particular, transformation as a part of pleasure, and how this book tries to elicit pleasure from the reader, and also how it creates maybe anxiety or distaste. It is a complex story and telling of stories, as we're going to see. So, of course, having a copy of the Metamorphoses with you is really going to help you understand and answer the questions. I've posted for you the structure of the entire Metamorphoses, and this is not all of the first 4 books, but it encompasses maybe some of the biggest stories. We have the beginning of the tale after the creation stories with Apollo and Daphne, and we're going to look at that. And then we get a series of stories about women, or females, I should say, although we do get the story of Phaethon at the end of book 1 and then the beginning of book 2. And I think next time we're going to think a little bit about these stories that span multiple books. This isn't something that we saw with the Iliad. It's not something that really happens in other kinds of epic. But Ovid seems really interested in trying to blur the lines between books. And so that's something maybe we'll think more about, is this line blurring as we go on. But we get then in book 2 the story of Callisto and Europa. Those are pretty big stories. Book 3, we get a whole big section at the beginning about the city of Thebes, although we don't go as far as the Oedipus stories. Everything sort of stops before we get there. We do get stories about Tiresias, who is familiar to us from the stories of the Theban cycle from Antigone and Oedipus. And then we get these stories at the end of book 4. We have these daughters of Minyas who are sort of sitting around telling stories amongst themselves, and I don't list all of the stories here, but we'll look at the story of Pyramus and Thisbe and at Salamacis and Hermaphroditus. And then book 4 starts with the story of Perseus, and that story then continues again into book 5. So it's another one of those stories that really spans multiple books. I do want to say, before we start talking about this, that the Metamorphoses in general is a story that is filled with all kinds of sexual assault, and that is one of maybe the intriguing features about it, why there is so much in there, and what Ovid is trying to do, and what he's trying to tell us about Roman culture by sort of starting with all of this. But it's something that you should absolutely know. So our first story is Apollo and Daphne. And this is the first of a series of stories where we see gods who sexually assault females. The god in this case is Apollo, but it's going to be quickly followed by stories of Jove. Jupiter is his other name. And also we're going to see stories of Mercury. We'll see stories of Bacchus. We're going to see many, many stories where gods are doing things that are harmful, and often, almost always harmful toward females. This story starts, and I think this is one of the things that is sort of hard about Apollo's story, is that when it starts off, it starts with him mocking the god Cupid, who fires his arrows at him, who makes Apollo fall in love with Daphne. And so he begins observing her. But one of the discomforts here is that we see Apollo not just sort of approaching her and trying to win her over, but really looking at her as a kind of voyeur. On page 18 of your text, and this is probably right around line 500, we get a description of him as he's watching her. And it says that the god burned, nourished that futile love of his by hoping. He sees the long hair hanging down her neck, uncared for, says, but what if it were combed? He gazes at her eyes, they shine like stars. He gazes at her lips and knows that gazing is not enough. He marvels at her fingers, her hands, her wrists, her arms bare to the shoulder, and what he does not see, he thinks is better. So one of the things we see Apollo doing in this section is he is seeing her, but he's not really seeing her. I mean, everything he sees about her, he wants to change, like her hair. He wants to imagine it differently, or he wants to imagine those parts of her that he doesn't see. And he dissects her as he goes through this story. She does, even as he has fallen in love with her, according to our narrator, he doesn't seem to love her. He's just sort of attracted by these various pieces of her that he puts together in his mind. And that, I think, is really disconcerting to us, or it should be disconcerting to us as we read through here. And I think that Ovid means for us to feel that this is not acceptable, that it's uncomfortable. He's completely unable to see her point of view. He is not interested in the fact that she is not interested in him. And instead, he ends up making this speech to her as she is running away from him. And yet, that speech is really the speech of somebody who is kind of bumbling. He doesn't come across as the smartest guy. He certainly doesn't come across in his speech as somebody that you maybe should be really terrified by, right? He says, run a little slower, and I will run, I promise, a little slower, right? And he says, I am no shepherd. I am not just a plowboy. You foolish girl, don't you know who you're running away from? I am the Lord of Delphi. And then he starts giving his resume, and he just sounds, by the end of it, kind of crazy, as though this is the way to win somebody over. And yet, it is clear from Daphne's reaction to him that he is absolutely threatening and terrifying to her. And he has no interest, in the end, in doing anything that would dispel that notion, so that her prayer to be transformed is the thing that saves her. And yet even that doesn't save her, because he breaks off a piece of her. She becomes the emblem of Apollo and everything he stands for. And that seems tragic, I think, by the time we get to the end, even though stirring, she seemed to consent. She seemed to be saying yes. But of course, the breeze in her branches, it's hard to say that that's a definitive yes. It is funny. It is beautifully written. It is vivid, I think, in a way that we can sort of imagine it cinematically, as with many of these stories that Ovid tells. And yet it is profoundly disturbing. And there is, I think, throughout this book, that sense of pleasure and that sense of unease that Ovid deliberately weaves together for us. We see similar kinds of things happening with the story of Io, which happens right after this. In case you thought that this was an anomaly, no, this is just how the gods behave. And it's just that we have a different god conceived of as the aggressor in this story. Io's story, similarly, is both sort of comedy and tragedy combined. She's been transformed into this cow. We see her scratching out with her hoof the letters I and O so that her father recognizes her now as a cow. And that seems ridiculous. And yet what is not ridiculous is the violence that is visited upon Io's body and the way that Jupiter feels free to transform her so that he doesn't get in trouble with Juno. And of course, if we go further on to the end of the stories in book 2, we get the story of Europa, which similarly tells us a story we are already familiar with, right? The story of Europa, who is, in this version, captivated by Jupiter, who is doing everything to make himself seem absolutely unthreatening, rolling around on the ground, offering his belly up for scratches, seeming like he is nothing to be afraid of, and turning in to be something that she should be profoundly afraid of. So this trickiness of the gods, this incapacity to understand the perspective of someone else, the willingness to treat them like playthings, is the story that we get in these opening books of the Metamorphoses. In case you thought it was only females who were toyed with in this way, we have the story of Actaeon and Diana in book 3, where we have a male who stumbles upon Diana as she is taking a bath, and this should seem like no mistake at all. It is just bad luck. And yet Diana feels that this is such a grave injury to her body that she condemned him to death, and not just any death, but a particularly horrific death. One of the things that we see throughout this story is the way that gods tend to blame humans for things that we would not think of as misdemeanors, just bad luck, errors. If we look at page 41, and this is the story of Callisto, we have Jove, who is, approaching Callisto and trying to win her over. She is not interested. She is devoted to Diana. She has pledged that she is going to remain a virgin forever. And he gives himself away. He, of course, has disguised himself again. And it says toward the very bottom of page 41 that Callisto really struggled against him. Even Juno, had she been there, might have forgiven. But girls are frail, and anyway, who could conquer the might of Jove? That line about Juno, if she had been there, might even have forgiven, tells us what we already know from earlier stories, like the story of Io, that Juno doesn't care if the female is not to blame. She blames her. She blames all of the females that Jove chooses to sexually violate or to have a relationship with, depending on whether they are willing or not. Diana acts similarly here. We have no sense that she has any mercy for him, that he just happens to show up and that is enough to condemn him. And again, we get this kind of ridiculous elaboration about all the names of all his various dogs, which get thrown in there as some kind of catalog, like the catalog of ships in book 2 of the Iliad. But it seems kind of ridiculous and funny, and yet what happens when they attack him is not funny at all. It is tragic. One of the things I think that's always hard about this book, the Metamorphoses, is that a book like the Iliad, we know what we're getting into. It is a serious book. It is about warfare. It is about bloodshed. It is ugly. It is heartbreaking. The Metamorphoses, on the surface, come across as just a series of little stories. Stories that are, some of which might be familiar to you. Stories that are just about things that have happened, transformations that have occurred. And part of them are told with this kind of lightheartedness. And yet, in a moment, it can turn from lighthearted to absolutely cruel. And I don't think that that is a coincidence. I think Ovid wants us to see the way that life can turn on a dime, right? That you could be laughing one moment and crying the next. And this story is one that's filled with tales that operate in exactly this way. For a little variation, I guess, I wanted to look at a couple of stories in here that are stories of transformation, but are not stories necessarily about violation. One of these is the story of Tiresias, and this is just a tiny, tiny story that is encapsulated within Book 3. Just 20 lines, essentially. But we get the story of, the setup is that there's an argument between Jove and Juno about who derives more pleasure from sex. Do men derive more pleasure or do women? Jove says women or females definitely get more out of sex than men do, and Juno argues the opposite. And they take this to Tiresias, who we learn in the course of this story has had experience as both a male and a female. He was born male. He hits a couple of snakes and is turned into a female. And then here in the image, you can see him striking the snakes a second time, 7 years later, and being turned back into a male. So he has had experience both as a male and a female. And so he can settle this argument, and he sides with Jove, and then he is given a further transformation. He is punished by Juno and made blind, and Jove cannot undo that, but instead he gives him the power of prophecy. And so then we have this sense of Tiresias as this character who goes forward as a prophet in other stories that we have seen. But what I think is interesting about this story is that even as it's this little throwaway story, we see the way that sex and sexuality operates in this book. Now, not all stories up to this point through Book 4 are about sexual violation or sexual relationships, but many of them are, and we see then the role that sort of human sexuality plays, at least in these stories, at least the stories that Ovid is choosing to tell. And we see the way that the gods behave towards those that they want to have sex with. And we see the way that that even things that maybe don't initially seem like sexual errors, right, like Actaeon, but because he sees the naked body of Diana, because there is sort of implicitly threat in a male gaze, she sort of takes him out in this incredibly violent manner. So there's this sense, at least in the early world, right? And I mentioned that Ovid is going to move his story forward in time. So we start with these stories of the gods. We start to get humans incorporated in. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And then we'll move sort of fully into the human realm, starting in Book 6. But at least when the universe is first coming into being, it's really about the gods and their sexual desires. Like that, for Ovid, is where the story begins. And I think that's interesting too, because I don't think that is the way that we think about Greek versions of these stories operating. In Book 4, we get our first sort of human story. There's no god involved in this story. There's no Daphne is, in that initial story, we might not think of her as a goddess, but she is a nymph, so she's an immortal being. She's not human, and that is true for many of the individuals in those early stories. But Pyramus and Thisbe is a story about a man and a woman. Moreover, it is not a Greek story. It is set in Babylon, so it is set in modern-day Iraq. It is a story that is essentially a Romeo and Juliet story about these two young lovers who are separated by their families. They're not allowed to interact, and yet they have fallen in love, and so they are determined to thwart their family and run away together and live their life together. But of course, there is a mistake. Thisbe goes out, she drops her veil, and a lion who has just come back from the hunt sees it and sort of plays with it and gets blood on it. When Pyramus comes out, he thinks that Thisbe has been killed by the lion and commits suicide, and then Thisbe herself commits suicide when she sees what Pyramus has done. And the transformation is that their blood then soaks into the ground and then is sucked up by the mulberry tree, which you can see in the image behind Thisbe, and turns the fruit of the mulberry this sort of purpley color, whereas it used to be white, according to the story. So this is a story that is going to sort of transition us. It starts to move us toward the world of humans and away from the world of the gods. But you can see that there is still themes that we see in these earlier 3 books that are not going away. Human error, just making a mistake, and that mistake being deadly. And this sort of the sense that sexuality is still in operation in these stories, that this is a story about 2 people who are in love who are not allowed to be together. Our final story that we'll look at is yet another story of sexual violation, but again, in case you thought it was only male gods who commit sexual violence, we have the story of Salamacis and Hermaphroditus. Now, this is sort of an anomaly in this book, but I think it's not a coincidence that Ovid chooses to incorporate pretty much the one story that we have of a female committing sexual assault on a male. Salamacis is somebody who, according to the story, is supposed to be following Diana. She is chastised by her fellow nymphs for not conforming to a chaste lifestyle. Instead, she sits around this fountain, she uses it as a mirror, she combs her hair. We get this sense of her as an incredibly vain individual. And she again tricks Hermaphroditus, who is in no way interested in her. She sort of starts by saying, I would love to marry you, you're so beautiful, don't you want to be with me? And he clearly does not want to be with her and makes that really explicit. On page 92, you can see he blushes, he doesn't want to be with her. He says, stop it, I'm gonna leave. And she's like, no, I will leave, and then tricks him. And we see, of course, he transforms, she sort of transforms. But again, we see the way that individuals in this story continue to be overpowered by sexual desire. It seems that if there is one thing that is consistent throughout these 4 books, it is that people have very little control over themselves. So, in summary, what is it that Ovid is trying to do in these first 4 books? Well, he paints for us very clearly a world where the gods are unpredictable and incredibly vindictive. We humans have no sense of security in this world as it opens in the Metamorphoses. Humans are prone to error, but humans are also lured into error through no fault of their own. And yet, just making a mistake, an honest mistake, a mistake for which we maybe would never blame these individuals, the Greek gods, as told by Ovid, absolutely blame them. There is no escape from the gods if they choose to mark you. Curiously, many of the errors pertain to sexual desire, or sex is in some way the problem. But we also should note that there are some stories sprinkled in here about humans who do not know their limits or who choose to challenge the gods in some way. And this is something that we're going to sort of see played out in Book 5 and again in Book 6 before the gods are sort of left behind. But if you think about that story of Phaethon in Book 2, for the most part, or the story of Semele, who encourages Jove to show his Jovely form to her. These are individuals who are told, don't do this, right? Please, please, please do not do the thing that you're thinking about doing. And they choose to do it anyway. So divine vindictiveness and lack of concern for humans is one thing we see in this world. And also human error, sometimes humans even stupidly pursuing their own desires.